So welcome. The title of today's event is Product Management and Marketing as Environmental Influencers. And just a quick recap, if any of you have not met the OPMMA volunteers, a lot of us are here today and we love to talk and we love to hear from you and we love to learn. So always feel free to reach out, join the LinkedIn group, have discussions, and we'd love to meet outside of these events as well. So I'm just transitioning to today. So our agenda is about thought leadership, and we're going to work through a little bit of material between myself and my co-presenter, Doug. We're going to be providing today, as well as through follow-up resources. We're going to be sharing materials that we review. And we're looking at action-oriented tools and frameworks that you in your organizations can leverage. And sometimes leveraging as ideas, sometimes it's implementing really good proven practices and benefiting from that rapidly. And we want to have today and certainly opportunity at future events, not only to discuss, but to really follow up and hear across different organizations. So we'll be giving out these slides. So just a quick introduction to myself and Doug. So Doug's been heavily involved in environmental activities and initiatives and is leading, consulting organization, helping organizations as we speak. So we're delighted to have Doug here and benefit from his experience and his background. I've had an opportunity to work with many large organizations as well as small ones to help implement environmental programs thoroughly across whole organizations as well as specific initiatives. So just thought I'd introduce both Doug and myself. So let me just start off. For those of you, I do have this mentioned in the slide, but for those of you who were with us on November 24th, we had a wonderful presentation. Charles Funk walked us through wonderful materials and really focusing on GHG net zero and where we are as the globe as a society, and the acute need and certainly the importance and significance of greenhouse gas emissions and the impact on the environment. For today, I'm going to provide an introduction to Doug, and I'm going to be touching on ESG opportunities holistically. And the reason I'm doing that is that some of your organizations may not be in a position right now simply because you're stretched thin. You may not know where to start. There's a lot of different drivers, but putting together a large environmental program and initiative may not be within the realm of achievable for the short term. You may be aspiring to that in the future. Certainly that is something that, we want to be able to talk about today as far as where your organization wants to go and what's achievable now. I use the Maslow hierarchy of needs to bring home the point that, as we heard previously, our air quality is not necessarily where we need it to be as, members of, and kind of visitors of the world here. And so really that impacts us as humans directly, right? We need air to breathe. Air interacts with water and certainly the food system and everything we need as humans. So the very basic needs that we have as members, of society and on the earth are at risk. So the urgency is very clear. The needs are very pressing, and environment, social, and governance roles and objectives are very helpful when it comes to addressing how companies think about and how they can take action to protect and certainly improve those very important aspects to humans. So the air system, waterways, our food resources, and even how we provide and can provide shelter to ourselves and certainly to those people around the world. From a product management and marketing role, we certainly respect and we think it's a wonderful opportunity to bring in product management and marketing functions to environmental considerations. It's such a natural fit. It's such a great opportunity for us to think about as product managers and marketers what it means to consider the environment in the context of what we do. So naturally, there's lots of attributes, but good product managers and good product marketers have business orientation, at their core. They're highly curious. They want to solve problems. They definitely understand what it's like and how to orient what they're doing to market and customers. And they really want to solve problems. And that's incredibly applicable and very helpful when it comes to thinking about and influencing your organization's environmental activities as you move forward. So what are we going to talk about today? Certainly, I have a few more slides that just set the table. Your organization may be already on a path, and opportunities are basically limitless to be able to take next steps and towards greenhouse gas measuring, reporting, and improving. And I'm going to leave that to Doug to really, he has fantastic resources to be able to touch on how to make that real and how to make that real within your context. If your organization isn't able to or isn't prioritizing greenhouse gas reporting and measuring, it's absolutely appropriate because success is going to be specific to your company. So if your company operates in a different kind of context, maybe you provide, you're a restaurant, maybe you provide additional or different types of products, and the topmost priority for you to attract customers, to retain your employees, is not greenhouse gas reporting, but it may be how you use water. If you're a laundromat, it may be what you put into the water system. Then that may be what your organization prioritizes. So success when it comes to environment is being specific to your company. And it's definitely helpful, and as we do often with product management and product marketing, to start to think about and develop answers to why at the top level, so at your company level. So if you really want to get into influencing, understanding, thinking, and conversing at the company level is incredibly, helpful as you move any type of program forward. Okay, and I'm almost done here, but really, look at achievable actions to overcome inertia. So just to recap, you may or may not be able to dig into greenhouse gas reporting. Think about, if you're not able to dig into greenhouse gas reporting, what makes sense for your organization. Think about how to align what you're talking about, within your organization at the top level. And then think about actions that you're able to implement that are small enough that you can move forward on them. And basically overcome any inertia that you may have in your organization. And that inertia isn't necessarily a bad thing. If looking at the environment is new in your organization and talking about environmental activities is new, then this is the type of inertia that you're going to want to think about. And finally, as is so common in product context, think about where you want to end up. Think about that press release at the end of your product, and in this case, an environmental program or initiative, and think about communicating what that looks like, what that end goal looks like, and then becoming a champion within your organization for an environmental program. So I have a quote said by nobody, but doing nothing is no longer an option. And I think that everyone is basically at the point. It doesn't matter the size of the organization. It doesn't matter the industry your organization or your company is in. But really, we're at the point where doing nothing is no longer an option. And it's probably been the case for a little while. But I think that we've heard recently, and we're going to continue to hear for quite a long time, that the impetus is here, the momentum is here, and doing nothing is no longer an option.
I think Amanda Brewster said that once, if I'm not mistaken.
Maybe. So I have a few more slides, and they're going to be available to people, certainly if we want to go through them from a discussion perspective today, but they will be able, to be leveraged as resources when we send out the slides that we're going to review today. So I'm going to stop sharing and hopefully provided a bit of an overview, and certainly try to make people welcome, here, not only today from a conversation perspective, but to get comfortable in your companies that it's okay to start somewhere. And we may aspire to do a lot, but making smaller steps, getting achievable activities underway in your organization, and then building on that, on those actions, will get you to a larger program, and will get you to a compelling set of next steps as you want to move your organization forward. So I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to hand the conversation over to Doug, who's going to be walking us through a fantastic resources that are going to make greenhouse gas reporting very real and very actionable within your organizations. Over to you, Doug.
Thanks, Amanda. I love that quote that was cribbed from either you or everyone about doing nothing is no longer an option. And what I love about Amanda's introduction is its pragmatism. As Amanda knows through the discussions that we've had, I do have a pragmatist streak, but I'm also a little bit idealistic. And so my spin on that quote is that not doing bad things is not the same as doing good things. And so I'm hoping by the end of this discussion, we'll have a few people who participated in the session who are motivated to not just not do bad things, which we're all doing, without malice and unintentionally, but taking some action to do some good things. So we'll go through, in my presentation, net zero planning for product managers and marketers. I'm the first to say I'm not an expert. I do have some exposure to this stuff through my role on the board of EnviroCenter. And I'll give a little shout out for EnviroCenter. For those of you who don't know, it is an Ottawa-based not-for-profit organization with a mission to provide people, communities, and organizations with practical solutions to lighten their environmental impact in lasting ways. So, if you leave this session and you're looking for more material, more ideas to prompt your action, I'd urge you to hit the EnviroCenter website. In fact, we have a couple of my colleagues from EnviroCenter here on the call today. So I only have 15 minutes to kind of give you religion here and to give you a little bit of material that you can start to digest. Unfortunately, that means I'm going to be going pretty fast. I'm going to introduce some core greenhouse gas emissions management concepts. I'll point you to some resources that hopefully will be useful to you. And through the process, hopefully stimulate some awareness, the discussion for later in this video conference, and ultimately some actions that you can take, pragmatic actions that you can take within your roles. As Amanda mentioned, Charles gave us a fabulous introduction to the whole climate awareness and greenhouse gas emissions issue at our last session. And there's many ways to analyze and act on emissions. We talked quite a bit about global emissions and emissions by country or province or city, even emissions looked at from an individual basis or a sectoral basis, generated by power generation, by transportation, by heat, or by the construction sector. What we're going to focus on today is looking at emissions and how to monitor and reduce emissions on an organizational basis, a corporate basis, and on a product basis, because that kind of gets it down to areas that the people on this conference can act upon. Just to step back for a second, mainly we're looking at greenhouse gas emissions because we can't afford to do nothing any longer. The good news is that it's often good for business to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It will often result in improved competitiveness as a way of creating differentiation or as a means of boosting profit by reducing costs or allowing you to charge a higher price for your products or services. It allows you to capitalize on the growing demand for low carbon products and services. Your investors are very likely demanding greater transparency around your impact on the climate. And at some point, being transparent will be a way that allows you to more easily access capital to fund your growth. customers are the same, your consumers are the same thing. They're looking for environmental accountability, and they're gradually rolling that into their purchase decisions, whether individuals or businesses. Your stakeholders, the community you live in, the associations you are part of are all starting to think about measurement and disclosure of emissions. Of course, the government is well on the way to implementing policies that will constrain our operating practices if we are not cognizant of our greenhouse gas emissions. And conversely, they'll also be providing incentives for businesses to tackle the issue more aggressively. And then, of course, from a risk management perspective, addressing this issue will ensure your long-term competitiveness. And for those of you that are in businesses that have assets that are very dependent on fossil fuels, for example, it avoids the long-term risk of stranded assets. So lots of good business reasons. This isn't just feel good, there's business reasons. So let me give you a little bit of heads up of some key concepts we're going to go through, and then I will gradually, hopefully, become part of your lexicon. The first are called emission scopes or corporate scopes of emissions. So you hear me talk about scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions. It doesn't sound like English, but it'll make sense in a second. The concept of a product life cycle assessment and a product carbon footprint. And these are both ways to help you understand the greenhouse gas emission component of your product. Let me start with this idea of classifying corporate emissions. So the greenhouse gas protocol standards break greenhouse gas emissions into 3 categories: scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. And by the way, when we talk about greenhouse gases, we're not just talking about carbon dioxide. There's a number of gases that contribute to global warming. And even though we talk about CO2 and carbon, it's kind of shorthand for all these greenhouse gases. Scope 1 emissions are those that are directly emitted by your company, your organization, either through the running of your vehicles or the running of your heating systems. It's the greenhouse gas emissions that come from your activities. Scope 2 is indirect emissions that come from the energy that you use in your operations. So any electricity or natural gas products or oil that you might purchase, there are emissions that are created through the production of that energy, and then you use that energy. And so when you consume that energy, you are indirectly responsible for scope 2 emissions. Scope 3 emissions are the ones that are interesting. These two are indirect emissions, but they're intimately related to your business operations. They're all the emissions that your organization is indirectly responsible for up and down your value chain. They're the items that you buy from your suppliers, it's the emissions that your employees generate when they commute, when you travel, all the way through to the emissions that are created when your customers use your product and ultimately either discard your product or recycle your product. So the scope 3 emissions cover your entire value chain, upstream and downstream. And as you might imagine, for most organizations and for most products, it's the scope 3 emissions that are the biggest portion of the emissions associated with your business activities. Of course, because they're indirect, they can also be a little challenging to manage. So they require more work. So we've talked about upstream scope 3 emissions that are your indirect emissions, scope 1 and 2 emissions that from a corporate perspective are the ones that you're responsible for through your operations, and then downstream, which are the emissions indirectly associated with your supply chain. And these are ways of categorizing your corporate emissions. But as product managers and product marketers, we can also cut our products in the same categories. So we can think in terms of the material acquisition and the components that we use as part of the input into our products and our production. We can think of the emissions associated with our production process and the emissions associated with the storage, transportation, use, and end of life of our products. So as a product manager, you are able to characterize and take responsibility for the emissions related to your specific product as a component of the emissions that your entire company are responsible for. One of the ways that we can do that is through an activity called the life cycle assessment of emissions. And this is a way of quantifying the environmental impact of an industrial, commercial, or consumer product throughout its life cycle, from raw materials through manufacturing or production, through distribution and usage, all the way through recycling. And the value of performing a life cycle assessment of emissions is that it can guide your redesign of products or your design of products or services if they're new. Oh, sorry about that. Which means that it can help guide your sourcing decisions about materials. It can guide your production process, your choice of transportation modes, but it can also guide the trade-offs that you make between the emissions that your customers might make when they use your products and the emissions that you incur when you produce it. So it kind of gives you this holistic view. And that's the beauty of being able to look at both the upstream and the downstream elements of your product life cycle. What a life cycle assessment will generate for you is a product carbon footprint. And that product carbon footprint is basically, to make it really simple, the single number that is the carbon dioxide equivalent sum of the emissions generated by your product over its life. If you're a B2B company where you're creating a product or service that will be used as a component of another organization's business, you might create a cradle to gate product carbon footprint, which covers all the processes that go into making your product all the way to when it leaves your point of business or your gate. If you're a B2C organization and creating B2C products or services, then you would maybe do a cradle to grave or a cradle to cradle product carbon footprint that covers the complete life cycle from extraction and production to use and end of life and recycling by your customers. So the first one is more of a partial footprint and the second one is a complete one. The way you do that is either through actual measurements or accessing data that's available that provide estimates of the carbon associated with particular raw materials, the amount of fuel or energy you use, estimates about how much energy your product uses when it's being used by your customers, etc. You can add that all up and create a single number view. There's a whole bunch of tools and services that are available. SAP has a very impressive product footprint management tool that is integrated into their product suites that some of you might find useful. There's also a life cycle tracker tool that can give you some of the data that you might need. A product carbon footprint is a standardized view, and what it does, although there are a variety of standards involved, but ultimately what it does is it enables you to have a single number that you can use as a benchmark for progress as you improve your greenhouse gas emissions. It can also serve as a bit of a purchasing decision influencer for customers. So for example, in the image I have here, Logitech has begun labeling its products with a kilograms of CO2 equivalent emission, so that as a purchaser, you can make a purchase decision that's informed also by your knowledge about their greenhouse gas emissions, or the greenhouse gas emissions of this particular product. When you do a carbon footprint, what you get is something like this. You get a single number, or because there is some uncertainty in emissions in various components, you can get a range or a mean of kilograms of CO2 equivalent that this particular product generates through its life cycle, from product component sourcing all the way through end of life. So here's an example that HP has created for one of their laptop computers. And believe it or not, the mean generated through the life of this computer is 330 kilograms of CO2 equivalent. That's a lot of kilograms of CO2 generated. Even the iPhone in your hand or in your pocket, Apple has calculated through its life cycle generates about 64 kilograms of CO2 equivalent emissions. So wouldn't it be great if you knew for your product what the benchmark was around emissions, if you knew what the product carbon footprint was for your product or service? I know not everyone has hardware products. A lot of people are in the software business or cloud-based business, and I just want to give you kind of a heads up that there are similar methodologies. The methodology is the same. It can be used for software platforms. And for example, both Google and Microsoft have provided carbon footprint information for their cloud-based platforms. So it's quite appropriate, even for software or cloud-based businesses, that you would be concerned about your product carbon footprint. I want to leave you with one thought about carbon offsets. When we talk about net zero, what we're trying to do is to get the net greenhouse emissions to zero. And there is a practice of buying carbon credits to compensate for greenhouse gas emissions. Some of you may have done this, for example, vacation travel that you would have done, and bought carbon offsets to offset the carbon emissions associated with your flight. It's well-intentioned. The challenge often is that the genuine impact of these credits, or of the projects that are being funded by these credits, can sometimes be questionable, whether they will have genuine long-term impact. And there are those that can use the credits as a means of greenwashing and kind of obscuring their own activities around greenhouse gas emissions reduction, which is why they should also always be considered as a last resort from a business perspective, from a product perspective. It should be that we use carbon offsets at the end of a process of reducing our absolute emissions, and that what we're really aiming for as businesses and product managers is an actual decarbonization of our products and processes and organizations. I'm not saying don't consider offsets. I'm saying the priority is to actually reduce, and then use offsets to get the stuff that you can't eliminate. So what does it mean for a product manager? I'd suggest, as Amanda said, you want to align your activities with your corporate emission reduction plans and metrics. You should be considering what your customers' emission reduction targets are. And in fact, you should be finding out what they are and integrating those targets into your customer requirements planning as you're planning the evolution of your products. You can also lever your existing processes. All product managers have cost reduction plans, they have quality plans, they have ISO certification plans, and in all cases, having initiatives to reduce greenhouse gases can serve as a component of these plans. Ultimately, I would recommend that you want to establish what your product carbon footprint is and have a plan to, over time, reduce that footprint. That involves performing a scope 1 to 3 product lifecycle assessment, as we discussed, to generate that baseline footprint. Set yourself some time-bounded targets that are aligned to corporate objectives, to standards, to customer requirements, to the government regulations that you expect, and then develop the action plans. Ideally, your product lifecycle assessment will identify some hot spots that you can get some quick reductions on, and integrate that thinking into your product management process. And as Amanda said, monitor it, report it, and definitely promote it when you make progress. I won't go into this, but there are a lot of resources available to product managers or marketers that are interested in pursuing initiatives. As I mentioned, EnviroCenter has green business toolkits that are accessible online that I would recommend that you look at. And there are a plethora of carbon footprint management consultants and software available. It doesn't take a whole bunch of research to start to get access to them. So just to wrap up, before we move into discussion, I encourage you to think about what your plan is going to be. Let's face it, all our products, our services, our companies pollute. We all use too much energy and we all generate greenhouse gas emissions. It's just the reality of the way we live and the way our businesses operate. You're the product owners, and so I'm going to encourage you then to own the issue. But you're not alone. There's lots of help available. Again, I would give a nod to EnviroCenter's Ottawa Green Business Program. I would certainly recommend that you participate in that program and become part of the community that's trying to not just not do bad things, but do good things with respect to climate change. So thank you, and I will turn the floor back over to Amanda to get us into our discussion groups.